International Relations and Cooperation Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor has welcomed the United Nations Security Council's resolution. It adopted it for the month of Ramadan, ending in 2 weeks' time. 14 council members voting in favour of that resolution, which also calls for the unconditional release of all hostages. The United States abstaining from that vote.
The Security Council has struggled for some time to frame a consensus resolution calling for a ceasefire. So the fact that we now have a resolution which had the majority of support of the Security Council, I think is a very important first step. But I believe it is early days. We welcome the resolution, especially the fact that none of the permanent members vetoed it. So we are now looking forward to action on the basis of the resolution, and particularly those aspects that refer to a permanent ceasefire and negotiations to end this conflict as soon as possible.
Well, let's talk about this with writer and commentator Joseph Ochieno, who's joining us from Kampala in Uganda. Good morning, Joseph. Thank you very much for your time. So the reactions have been coming in thick and fast, but we want to know, how big a moment is this really, given that this is the first time, it would seem, on this matter the U.S. has taken this position, and John Kirby also saying this is, it does not reflect a shift in policy.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and observers will give different views and opinions of this, but generally I think it's an extremely important step, particularly because on this occasion the U.S. opted not to veto, but certainly to abstain. Abstention, you can treat it in any way you like, but almost certainly, if you like, it is saying nay to this, rather yea to this very particular important resolution. Sadly, this is a conflict that has reigned since around the time before, or just around the time I was born. In 1967, there is that popular UN resolution 242 that many of us, side by side with that resolution, were singing anti-apartheid campaigns, slogans around the world, and particularly across Africa. Anti-apartheid campaigns, side by side with the liberation struggles for the Palestinian people, has been a consistent, and that's why I'm suitably impressed, and many of us have been as observers, particularly on this continent, by the position taken by South Africa, and massively led by Dr. Pandor, the fantastic Foreign Affairs Minister for South Africa. The campaigns in recent times have not lost a notice from the key players around the world. It's a critical moment, because I think what has happened in Gaza since the beginning of this very particular war is extremely criminally atrocious. Those of us who've been around as young people on this continent campaigning around these issues, first of all on the continent, but generally observers around the world, you couldn't believe what is happening today, what has happened in the last several months. Maybe if I was thinking about it 10 years ago. And extraordinarily very important that the U.S. would look on. So it's important that they've attempted to shift, to move by actually allowing this resolution to go on. And in any case, if you look at the detail, there's really not much to ask for, except, an acquiescence to an extreme right-wing Israeli establishment. If anything, you might recall that an Israeli prime minister who sought peace, in 1997, Yitzhak Rabin, a fantastic guy, was assassinated by an Israeli extremist simply because he had come from attending a peace rally. A prime minister, one of the most revered, one of the most respected in that country. So let's forget the complexity of this conflict. So courage by South Africa, courage by the UN General Assembly, and in this case Security Council, and yes, a fast step on behalf of the United States. Let's see, as Dr. Pandor says, how things plan up, whether or not they will necessarily be respected.
And this will lead us into really our second question. But before we get there, this has been a credibility test for the United Nations, and whether it's the General Assembly or the Security Council, and it has been on the public stage for all to witness. And how can, masses of people, 6 months later, 100,000 killed or maimed, 2 million displaced, famine encroaching, preside over this tragedy that is unfolding. So these are the events today. As you pointed out, the South African government is saying it will be tested. What does it mean then, Joseph, in terms of the UN Security Council and the legal obligations flowing out of this finding for a ceasefire? We'll get to the exchange of hostages or the return of hostages in just a moment, or the release of hostages. But on this issue of an immediate ceasefire.
As I said, it's extremely important. And you know why I alluded to Resolution 242 and not Resolution of 1967? It was a unanimous resolution, if I may recall. I think almost the U.S. Supported it. In other words, it passed. It was a critical resolution that to date, had it been respected, wouldn't be here. Granted, over a period of 10 or so years, following the 242 resolution, both Israel and the Palestinians, in fact, PLO at the time, Palestinian Liberation Organization at the time, led for a very long time by Yasser Arafat, were rather reluctant to fully support that resolution because it was not definitive in terms of mention of Palestine, but it was very much about obligation and obliging, in this case, the occupying force to withdraw to the 1967 borders. And so it was very reasonable. Fast forward to where we are today. The U.S., as part of your early question refers, is losing massive ground in terms of international credibility, and it's absolutely in their interest that they compel, because really the stick is not with Netanyahu. The stick is actually in Washington. So President Joe Biden, looking towards an election, they normally play Israeli card, just like they used to play apartheid card, and they used to play China card, and they used to play Iraqi card. At the moment, possibly that's the card. In any case, I think, thanks to 24-hour media, thanks to social media, and thanks to networks like yourselves who are covering these things continuously and substantially and deeply, ordinary American citizens themselves are beginning to ask questions, because if they do not, compel their leadership to review their strategic positions and policies on some of these other things, they're going to lose face. In any case, as I say, is it about Joe Biden's elections, or is it the bigger issue, which of course is Americans' foreign policy interest, meaning that basically Israel is the little big boy that you compel to be, if you like, your strategic watchdog in the Middle East. We know some of their strategic watchdog boys, mainly boys and girls, but mainly boys on the African continent, what havoc they wrought on us in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Angola, here in my own native Uganda, and Congo. This is what late President Obote calls Nyampalas are terrible guys. But when it comes to the question of Israel, it's not quite clearly a single individual as in Nyampala, but an outpost nation state. I genuinely believe that where the world has actually gone, post-apartheid and post the glories of Nelson Mandela's of this world and the emergence of powerful other nations like China, in a rather civil way, it is actually possible for us to have a world without Cold War, a world in which shared interests are apparent, but also where shared strategic interests can also be discussed, and if you like the other side, respect it.
Joseph, this is an important subject that gives some of that architectural history that underpins a lot of what we are seeing today, especially when you talked about the invocation of that 1967 moment and that UN Resolution 242. And I would love for us in a separate conversation maybe to come back to that, because it does give context to a lot of what we're seeing happening today. But I want to come to the second piece of what the UN Security Council decided on yesterday, and this was the unconditional release of all the hostages. Hamas is saying that it will engage in immediate prison exchange processes for the release of prisoners on both sides. But is what it's asking for an extension of what is already on the table? Is it likely to bring in any complexity to, this resolution actually being given life?
From 242, there has been nothing but posturing. In fact, from Hamas side, you feel relieved that they've taken that position, because they could also have taken a generally hard line. So in fact, if anything, they've actually put the bait on for the Israeli side to respond. If you recall, immediately after this, the Israeli side said that particular demand was going to make it much more difficult. They didn't possibly expect that the response would come from the Hamas side. So let's see how it goes. In any case, really, I actually quite think that, and I know we are blackmailed globally, particularly we Africans, we are blackmailed on some of this global politics that you shouldn't take sides. But me usually say that no, when it comes to some of the other things, including this season of Ramadan, indeed Easter, I would say, what would Jesus say? In any case, on this very particular issue, Hamas, call them anything, their positions are commonsensical because they also have a right to self-determination and existence, just like Israel does have. We know the Israeli question is not what Hamas did around that led to the launch of this war, but it's a historical thing. So Israel will continue to say that, well, they're under threat, they're under threat, they're under threat. But really, when you look back, pre-Hamas attack on Israel, what has been taking place since 1967, quite clearly take us back to 1948. And I think from about 1967 or thereabout, with 242, and indeed much later leading to the Oslo Accord of 1999, the world had moved extremely reasonably. The Palestinian side had given sufficient, much ground, if you want to call it, Egypt, that had been massively raided, occupied, and indeed many hundreds of their jets taunt Syria. The neighbors of Israel had moved very generally and very reasonably and conceded ground sufficiently. But where was the difference? The difference was now the narrow bit where Israel would come. Israel then goes on to elect a progressive peace prime minister in the name of Jacques Rabin. What happens? He's assassinated. So the issue really, in my opinion, is in the dogmatic orthodox element of Israel. And possibly many of us Africans who sometimes dogmatically follow Israel, thinking because it's, if you like, the Holy Land, is the land of Jesus, so it's a land that must have impunity. But as I said, no, Jesus would not side with Netanyahu today. Jesus would side with the mainstream common sense, where there is peace and where there's living side by side by Palestinians and Israeli people, and so it would be the same across the globe.
Joseph Ochieno, thank you very much for sharing your time with us and your analysis, joining us from Kampala in Uganda and reflecting on this latest decision by the UN Security Council. We saw 14 votes for an abstention by the United States, and still questions about where this leaves the official relationship between the US and Israel, traditional and historic allies.